Forget what the movies told you. Real cowboys didn't strut around with polished pistols and shiny belt rigs. They carried their guns in ways that were hidden, improvised, and sometimes lethal to the man wearing them. These were the real gun rigs of the frontier. Hand-stitched leather, iron hooks, saddle scabbards, and clever contraptions that solved one problem: staying alive. Every mark and buckle was born from necessity, not style. Today, we're digging up 15 designs history left behind. The rigs used by cowboys, outlaws, and lawmen who lived by the gun and trusted their gear more than luck. No myths, no Hollywood tricks, just the truth, the raw mechanics of how the West was actually armed. So tighten your cinch, keep your powder dry, and meet the contraption so reckless it was banned before most men ever saw it. Number 15. The Bridgeport Rig, too dangerous to be legal. In 1882, a Bridgeport, Connecticut inventor named Louis S. Flatow received U.S. patent number 258,640 for what he called a pistol holder. He meant to make the six-shooter faster. Instead, he made it frightening. The Bridgeport rig used a spring steel clip that clamped around the trigger guard of a Colt's singly action army. The revolver hung naked on the belt. No leather, no safety strap, hammer back, and trigger exposed. The shooter could twist, underscore, and fire in a single motion. It was the first mass-market attempt at a speed holster. Dealers such as Hartley and Graham of New York listed it briefly in their 1884 catalog, advertising instant readiness for the frontier marksman. A few scouts and Wells Fargo guards tested it. So did local deputies from Dodge City to Fort Worth. Within months came the accidents. A stumble, a startled horse, a man brushing a doorway, each could set off a round. One Kansas paper in 1885 described a deputy shooting himself in the thigh, mounting a wagon. By the late 1880s, the device had vanished from catalogs. Dodge City and Tombstone ordinances discouraged open rig carry altogether. Only a handful survive today in the Cody Firearms Museum and the NRA National Firearms Collection. Their steel clips warped from use. Half a century later, Hollywood revived its silhouette. Prop makers copied the exposed metal profile for the movie quick draw rig, turning a failed invention into a legend. The real gunfighters already knew the lesson. Speed means nothing if your holster kills you first. Number 14. The Derringer Vest Holster, the gambler's secret weapon. In a crowded saloon, a full-sized revolver was more risk than protection. Gamblers and riverboat men needed concealment, not spectacle, and the Derringer Vest Holster gave it to them. The Philadelphia Derringer, created by Henry Derringer in the 1850s, was only 6 in long and fired a single 41 caliber round. By the 1870s, metallic cartridge versions from Remington and Sharps ruled the Mississippi circuit. Taylor began sewing small leather sleeves inside waistcoats just behind the breast pocket. Slip into fingers, twist the barrel forward, and a gambler could lay steel on the table before anyone saw it coming. These rigs weren't factory issue. They were custom jobs from outfitters in New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Fine vests were lined with silk to hide the outline. Cheaper ones used canvas. The wealthy carried double-barreled Remingtons. Working men trusted percussion relics until they jammed or rusted. Newspapers from Deadwood and Dodge City mentioned gamblers producing Derringers as if from thin air. But accuracy was miserable and reloading under fire impossible. It was a one-shot insurance policy meant to end a quarrel, not win a duel. Surviving examples are rare. A Remington pattern vest holster rests in the Autry Museum of the American West. Another survives in private hands, still stitched to its decayed waistcoat. They remind us that the most dangerous men in the saloon didn't reach for their belts. They reached for their hearts. Number 13. The Saddle Scabbard. How cowboys really carried rifles. The image of a cowboy riding with a rifle slung across his back is pure Hollywood. On the real frontier, that would have been suicide. The West's working riders used a tool built for the saddle, not the shoulder. The saddle scabbard, developed during the 1860s and standard by the 1870s. The scabbard was a long leather sheath lashed to a saddle's pommel or skirt. It held a repeating rifle, usually a Henry Winchester 1866, 1873 or Spencer carbine, muzzled down and but angled forward for a quick grab. The position kept the weapon clear of the reins and safe from rain or dust. It also meant a rider could draw his rifle in a single motion while staying mounted. Cavalry troopers had issued versions, but cowhands and scouts bought theirs from saddlers in Abilene, Dodge City, or Fort Worth, often customizing the fit to their own gun. Most were made from thick cowhide, stitched by hand, and soaked in tallow to resist moisture. Some added a rawhide thong to tie the barrel tight during long rides. Historical accounts from the Chisholm Trail drives mention riders keeping spare ammunition in a small pouch sewn onto the scabbard's throat. It was a portable armory for men who might be 100 miles from town. Original frontier examples survive in collections at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. They're scratched, weathered, and sweat-darkened. Honest proof that a cowboy's rifle was never a fashion piece. It was just another tool holstered in leather and dust. Number 12. The double cross draw rig. Fast and fatal. A few frontier gunmen tried to outsmart the draw by crossing their hands. The double cross draw rig looked clever, but it proved as dangerous to its owner as to any opponent. After the Civil War, veterans carrying twin pistols, usually Colt 1860 Armies or Remington 1858s, began reversing one holster so the grips faced each other at the belt buckle. Each hand reached across the body, copying cavalry's saber drills. Saddlers in St. Louis and San Francisco even built mirrored sets for professionals chasing symmetry. It worked in theory. The cross draw kept pistols clear of the rear's legs and easy to reach while seated. But in a real fight, the motion tangled elbows and slowed reaction. A wrong grip or inward swinging barrel could sweep across the shooter's own chest. Photographs of Wild Bill Hickok and other lawmen show crossed belts. Yet accounts from the time confirm most wore them for posing, not battle. By the 1880s, experienced gunmen returned to strong side rigs or the rising Mexican loop, which offered speed without the risk. A few gamblers kept the twin rig for show, silver-studded leather gleaming under saloon lamps, but the fad burned out fast. One surviving pair in the Autry Museum of the American West tells the story in scuffed leather and powder stains. Proof that the West rewarded what worked, not what looked smart. Number 11. The Slim Jim holster, the original California quick draw before the low-sling Hollywood belt ever existed. The Slim Jim ruled the frontier. Born in California during the 1850s, it was the first holster built for speed instead of ceremony. Gold Rush saddle makers along the Sacramento and San Francisco trails designed it for the Colt 1851 Navy and later the Colt Army Model 1860. Its shape was minimal, an open-top pouch of heavy cowhide that gripped the revolver by friction alone. No flap, no skirt, no buckle to fumble with. A tapered toe and high ride kept the muzzle from slapping the thigh while on horseback. Early examples from makers like L.D. Nimsky and Maine and Winchester show hand-told floral patterns, but function came first. California leather workers hardened the hide with wax and tallow so a man could reholster one-handed without collapsing the pouch. When the design spread east after 1858, Texans added a narrow belt loop and border stamping. By the 1870s, it was standard gear for stage line guards and trail riders. It fit perfectly with the lighter .36 and 44 caliber revolvers common before the Peacemaker era. The Slim Jim faded only when heavier six-shooters demanded more support. Its successor, the Mexican Loop, borrowed its clean lines, but reinforced the body with an extra skirt. Authentic Slim Jims survive in the Autry Museum and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, each one darkened by sweat and age. Simple, fast, and unprotected, just like the men who carried them. It was the West's first true quick-draw rig long before anyone called it that. If you've made it this far, you're clearly into the real history, not the Hollywood stuff. Tap that like button so I know to dig deeper into more forgotten frontier gear next time. Number 10. The Scout Saddle Scabbard, the Frontier Rifle Carry System. Long before rifle slings and truck racks, the West Scouts carried their weapons the practical way on the horse itself. The saddle scabbard was their rifle's home, shield, and lifeline on the move. First adopted during the Civil War by mounted units armed with Spencer carbines, the idea spread quickly across the frontier. By the 1860s and 70s, civilian scouts, buffalo hunters, and cowhands all used leather scabbards lashed to a saddle's pommel or near side skirt. They were made from thick oil-soaked cowhide, stitched by hand, and angled forward so the rifles but sat just under the rider's thigh. The design kept the barrel out of the dust and let a man draw while mounted. Military suppliers like Watervlad Arsenal issued regulation versions with brass throat reinforcements, while frontier saddlers in Abilene, Fort Worth, and Santa Fe turned out civilian patterns for Winchesters, Sharps, and Henrys. A good scabbard was molded wet around its rifle, dried stiff, and greased with beeswax or tallow to shed rain. Trail accounts from the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry and the Chisholm Trail Drives mention scouts who refused to ride without one. A lost rifle on the plains often meant a lost life. Recovered originals in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West show sweat stains and trail wear so deep the leather has fused to the form of a Winchester 1873. The saddle scabbard turned the horse into part of the weapon. It let a man carry repeating firepower across 1,000 miles of open country and still have both hands free for the reints. Number 9. The Shoulder Rig, the detective's concealed classic. Not every gunfighter wore his weapon in plain sight. By the 1870s, men who worked in cities or didn't want to announce they were armed turned to the shoulder rig. Its roots lay in the Civil War's cavalry pommel holsters. Veterans adapted the crossbody carry for pistols, slinging a holster under the arm on a leather harness. Early commercial versions appeared in catalogs from firms like Shaverling and Daly of New York around 1875, advertised as gentlemen's concealed rigs. Taylor and gunsmiths along the Mississippi River Circuit began sewing custom versions for gamblers, detectives, and traveling agents. The most common pairing was a Remington double-barreled Derringer or a Colt 1849 pocket revolver. The gun rested under the left arm, angled for a right-hand draw through the coat front, hidden, balanced, and silent. Pinkerton detectives and Wells Fargo guards often favored them on long rail journeys where open carry drew attention, period. Records from Alan Pinkerton's agency correspondence mention crossbelt holsters issued to Planello agents in Chicago and St. Louis. Unlike heavy belt rigs, a shoulder holster kept the weapon accessible even when seated. The design's weakness was comfort. Leather straps dug into shoulders and summer heat made them miserable. Still, for men who lived by discretion, it was worth it. Original shoulder rigs are rare, but survive in the Autry Museum and NRA National Firearms Collection, often still paired with compact percussion revolvers. It was the sidearm of men who didn't boast about carrying until they had to use it. Number 8. The Halfried Rig, the Forgotten Hybrid. Between the plain utility of the Slim Jim and the heavy strength of the Mexican Loop came a short-lived compromise the frontier called the Halfried. It was a transition design, half-old California speed rig, half-reinforced trail holster, and it never quite found a home. The pattern emerged in the 1870s as revolvers grew heavier and longer-barreled. Cowboys wanted the quick draw of the Slim Jim, but the retention of the newer looped holsters. Saddlers in Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico began stitching an extra layer of leather behind the pouch, creating a stiff skirt but leaving the front open. It gripped the gun high and tight without the full wraparound of the Mexican loop. Period makers such as Maine and Winchester of San Francisco and Collins and Morrison of St. Louis sold small runs, usually for Colt's singly action armies, and Smith and Wesson No. 3 seconds. Advertisements in the 1880 to Montgomery Ward catalog described them as half-loop rigs lighter than the border pattern. The idea worked, but fashion moved faster. By the late 1880s, the Mexican loop dominated the cattle trails and stage lines. Its stronger skirt protected revolvers from dust and rain. The half-breed quietly vanished, remembered only in saddlers' ledgers and a few surviving examples in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West and the National Cowboy Museum. It never became iconic, but it filled the gap between eras. Proof that even in the Old West, innovation could outpace demand. Picture it. You're on the trail in 1885, dust in your teeth. Someone's drawing on you. You've got seconds. Which rig do you want on your side? Let me know. I'll pin the smartest answer. Number 7. The California Pattern Rig, where the Western holster was born. Long before Texas or Tombstone defined the gun belt, the first true Western holster came out of California in the 1850s. It was called the California Pattern, and nearly every later design copied its bones. The state's gold rush saddle makers, men like Samuel H. Young of Stockton, and Maine and Winchester of San Francisco built the pattern for the Colt 1849 pocket and Colt Navy 1851. The pouch was narrow, deeply contoured, and stitched to a backing skirt that spread the weight across the belt. For the first time, a revolver hung close to the hip instead of dangling from a flap. This change mattered. Miners and express riders could now sit a horse or climb a wagon without the guns swinging loose. The California pattern also introduced the reinforced throat, a double layer of waxed hide that let the shooter reholster one-handed. Its elegant border stamping, sunbursts, oak leaves, and vine scrolls became the language of Western leather work for decades. When craftsmen carried the design east along the immigrant trails, Texans adapted it with heavier stitching and thicker skirts. That hybrid evolved into the Slim Jim and later the Mexican loop, but the original California pattern remained the blueprint. Surviving specimens in the Autry Museum and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West show the same hand-told details still copied by holster makers today. It was the first rig to turn necessity into style and the starting point for every gun belt that followed. Number 6. The Belt Slide Rig, the working cowboy's DIY carry. Most frontier cowboys couldn't afford a custom holster, and many didn't need one. For everyday ranch work, they used something simpler, the Belt Slide Rig. Appearing in the 1870s, the belt slide was nothing more than a shaped leather loop with an open slot for a revolver barrel. It slid over the rear's cartridge belt and gripped the frame by friction. Cheap, light, and easy to repair. It was the do-it-yourself solution for men who needed a gun within reach but out of the way. Cowhands in Texas and the Dakota Territories favored the style for short-barreled Colt singly action armies and Smith and Wesson Frontier models. Contemporary photographs from trail outfits along the Chisholm Trail show plain untooled slides darkened by sweat and dust. A ranch hand could cut one from saddle scrap and soak it in water to shape around his pistol, then harden it with tallow overnight. Because it lacked a skirt or loop, the rig rode high on the hip, secure when galloping, and easy to draw while seated. But the same simplicity that made it handy also made it temporary. The leather stretched and softened quickly. Most were discarded when a payday allowed an upgrade to a Slim Jim or Mexican loop. Few survived, but examples found in Texas ranch collections and at the National Cowboy Museum show the same rough edges and hand-punched stitching. The belt slide wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. The holster of a man who built his own gear between cattle drives. Number 5, the pommel holster rig, the pre-cowboy setup. Before belts and loops defined the gunfighter's look, revolvers rode on the saddle. The pommel holster rig was how mounted men carried sidearms decades before the cowboy era began. The system dates to the 1840s when the U.S. Dragons and Texas Rangers used massive Colt Walker and Dragoon revolvers to heavy for a belt. Each saddle carried twin holsters, one on either side of the horn, secured by straps through the pommel. The design kept the pistols balanced and ready to draw with either hand while riding. Army issued sets made by S.H. Young and Company and Waterfly Arsenal were standard during the Mexican-Amian War, and civilian copies soon followed. Frontier lawmen, mail ridders, and pioneers used the same setup through the 1850s. Holsters were thick cowhide, often lined with wool or felt to protect percussion caps from moisture, and treated with tallow for waterproofing. A flap covered the hammer to keep rain and grit out, a necessity on long patrols. When lighter Colt Navy and Army models arrived in the 1850s, the pommel rig began to fade. Men wanted their sidearms on their hips, not their horses. By the Civil War, only cavalry units still issued saddle-mounted sets. Original pommel rigs are scarce, but survive in the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and the Cody Firearms Museum. Their twin flaps worn smooth by rains and weather. They mark the moment before the gun belt was born, when a man's holster was part of his horse, not his body. Number 4, the stagecoach guard rig defending the gold shipments. Long before armored cars, the frontier's safest vault was a wooden coach with a man and a shotgun on top. To protect mail and gold, those guards needed a rig that worked in tight quarters, the stagecoach guard rig. Wells Fargo issued its first guard rigs in the 1870s, designed for 10 and 12-gauge double-barreled coach guns with 18 to 20 inches barrels. Instead of hanging from a belt, the shotgun rode in a cross-chest scabbard, a wide leather loop-worn bandolier style from the shoulder to the opposite hip. The guard could draw and fire without dismounting or standing up on the coach. Company records held in the Wells Fargo Historical Archives describe these scabbards as heavy skirting leather, tallow-dressed, reinforced with brass rivets. They were built by saddlers in San Francisco, Sacramento, and Denver, each fitted to the guard's specific gun. Some rigs included a cartridge slide on the shoulder strap for quick reloads. Because a guard's hands were never free for long, the design had to secure the weapon even at full gallop. The muzzle slipped into a deep sheath near the hip, while the breech rested high across the chest, ready to swing forward in a single motion. Original examples survive in the Autry Museum and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, their leather darkened by sweat and powder. They're reminders that riding shotgun wasn't a phrase, it was a job description, and the guard's life depended on his rig. Number 3, the Mexican loop rig, the iconic cowboy holster. When people picture a cowboy's gun belt, they're usually thinking of the Mexican loop. It wasn't the first Western holster, but it became the image of the West itself. The design appeared in northern Mexico and the American Southwest during the 1870s. Local vaqueros and saddlers, many trained in Spanish leatherwork, adapted older California patterns by adding a wide skirt of leather behind the pouch. A slit in the skirt formed loops that the holster body slid through, locking it in place without stitching. The result was strong, flexible, and easy to repair on the trail. American makers such as Maine and Winchester of San Francisco and Collins and Morrison of St. Louis adopted the style almost immediately. By the 1880s, it had become standard gear for cowhands and lawmen carrying Colt single-action armies and Smith and Wesson frontier models. The extra skirt protected the gun from dust and the rider's sweat, while the open top allowed a clean, fast draw. The rig's distinctive curves and wide loops became a canvas for artistry. Border stamping, silver conchos, and dyed edges turned a piece of gear into personal identity. Photographs of Texas Rangers and Arizona Trail crews show the same pattern repeated from ranch to ranch. Dozens of authentic Mexican loop rigs survive in the Autry Museum, the Buffalo Bill Center, and private ranch collections across Texas. No other design defined the working West so completely or survived so unchanged. It was the holster that made the cowboy look like a cowboy. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. The hidden weapons the frontier tried to erase. Number 2. The Busado Rig, Hollywood's big lie. If the Mexican loop was the cowboy's real rig, the Busado was the movie version and it didn't exist on the frontier at all. The Buscadero rig was born not in Dodge City, but in Hollywood, California around 1922. Costumers for silent film westerns needed a lower riding belt that showed off the actor's revolver on camera. Leather worker Ed Bolin, a former Montana cowboy who opened a shop in Los Angeles, combined the Mexican loop with a drop loop belt that hung the holster below the hip bone. It looked dramatic, especially when paired with silver trim and engraved hardware. The design caught on with early stars like Tom Mix, Buck Jones, and Ken Maynard, whose quick-draw scenes demanded visibility, not authenticity. Movie posters and dime store toys spread the look worldwide, cementing the idea that every frontier gunfighter wore one. In truth, no photograph from the 19th century shows a working cowboy or lawman with a Busado-style drop holster. Real gunfighters preferred high-rise rigs that kept the weapon secure while riding. By the 1930s, Bolin's Hollywood shop was producing Busado belts for both actors and actual ranchers wanting the screen cowboy image. Today, his silver-studded originals are museum pieces in the Autry Museum of the American West and the National Cowboy Museum. The Busado rig became legend not because it was used in the West, but because it looked like the West. Hollywood invented it, and the world believed the lie. Number 1. The Ranger Belt and Holster Combo, the real gunslinger setup. Long before Hollywood dressed heroes in silver conchos and drop loops, the men who actually lived by the gun trusted one rig above all others, the Ranger Belt and Holster Combo. Developed in Texas during the 1870s, it evolved from the cartridge belts used by the Texas Rangers, who needed something stronger than the thin civilian strap sold back east. A typical Ranger belt was 2 layers of thick skirting leather stitched together with rawhide or brass rivets to prevent stretching in the heat. Between those layers ran a strip of cartridge loops, each hand cut to hold 44 or 0 for 5 rounds snugly against the body. Attached to it was a high-rise holster closely fitted to a Colt singly-action Army, Schofield, or Remington Army revolver. Unlike the flashy Buscadero rigs of film, this belt carried the gun high on the hip, angled slightly forward for a strong side draw. It was made for riding, fighting, and surviving, not for show, period. Rangers such as Captain Leander McNell and John B. Jones were photographed wearing versions of this setup during the violent years of border defense. The design proved so reliable that commercial makers like Hunter and Evans and Maine and Winchester began offering Ranger-style belts by the 1880s. Even U.S. military officers bought civilian versions for field use on the frontier. Authentic Ranger belts survive today in the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Their edges sweat-darkened from decades of patrol. They weren't props or ornaments. They were working gear for men whose lives depended on seconds and leather. If the Busado was Hollywood's fantasy, the Ranger Belt was the West's reality. The rig that truly earned the name gunslinger. 15 rigs from saddle scabbards to shoulder holsters. And everyone tells the same story. The real West wasn't clean, polished, or staged. It was practical, improvised, sometimes reckless, always real. These holsters weren't symbols. They were survival gear. Each design solved a problem no movie ever shows. Keeping a weapon dry, reachable, and ready before a man could blink. Every scar in that leather is a record of the frontier's engineering, not its mythology. Hollywood turned them into costumes. History turned them into evidence. And what's left are the originals, dark with sweat, burned with powder, cut by years of use. That's where the West actually lived. If you've made it this far, you've seen the truth of it. No myths, no legends, just the rigs that armed a generation who didn't need a script to survive. Stick around because the next story digs even deeper into the weapons that history tried to forget.